is going to talk a little bit about one of the authors we're reading this week, William Faulkner, who is one of my absolute favorite American modernists. So if you've read the overview in the Norton Anthology, you have a little bit of information already about just his life story. This particular slideshow and video is going to talk a little bit more about how he's related to modernism, especially through his aesthetics and his themes. So let's get started. So Faulkner is one of the most critically acclaimed and innovative writers of the 20th century. He's been routinely seen as one of the most important American modernists, but beyond modernism, he's influential for writers throughout the 20th century in America and beyond. He is one of the most extensively analyzed and criticized writers in American history. And by criticized, I mean literary criticism, where even today there are people who can focus their entire careers around Faulkner, his work, and his reputation. In the course of his writing, he wrote 19 novels, many of which are still considered to be some of the most important novels in American literature. And also during that time, he wrote over 100 short stories. In addition to that, he worked as a screenwriter. Some of the classic movies that you know, like To Have and to Have Not, were written by Faulkner. Some of the Bogart and Lauren Bacall movies have his writing in them. So he really has had a huge impact on American culture and American literature. And this is despite the fact that he was basically self-taught. He dropped out of high school, barely had 1 year of college education. So that everything he's done was based on his own reading, his own thinking, his own innovation. So let's talk a little bit about those stylistic innovations, because you're going to see he's very different than some of the other writers we've read. Unlike Hemingway, who has really short, terse, and what he would call a virile style of writing, Faulkner takes a different approach to the modernist project and the modernist agenda. He experimented with narrative chronology that includes using fragmented prose, broken time, flashbacks, and intricate plot structures. This makes his writing, especially his novels, oftentimes really difficult for a reader to read. They're not straight to the point realist fiction where you start at the beginning and end at the end. Oftentimes time is jumbled, and the narrative structure, the plot structure itself, is something that the reader is forced to piece together. And we're going to talk about why that is in just a minute. The other thing that he really experimented with was the different ways to represent mind and memory. And he was one of the earlier proponents in American literature, especially, of using stream of consciousness as a way of writing. He really explored the inner unedited thoughts of a character, and he did that in detail, which meant that sometimes his writing includes long meandering sentences, which really became a stylistic trademark. He also reflected the oral tradition he grew up with and developed a really unique and powerful style. And one of the places he's best known for this is his landmark novel, The Sound and the Fury. This is the kind of book that you need an additional book to kind of help you read. The opening chapter, or the opening section, the Benji section, is literally narrated in stream of consciousness by a character who we would say today has mental challenges or mental difficulties. This character, in his own perception of the world, constantly shifts between his childhood and his present and gets very confused. So the narrative in that part of the book represents that. Originally, Faulkner wanted to have The Sound and the Fury published with the Benji section published in different colored ink so a reader could follow the various timelines. I think there's like 4 or 5 different timelines all mixed together in that first chapter. And then as the book progresses, you get different characters. You get Benji, who is the youngest brother, Caddy, who everything kind of focuses around, is the sister, with this image of the kind of fall from Eden. You get Quentin, who has a very stream of consciousness style, but he is the college boy, so his style is very different. It's very kind of put together, but lyrical. And then finally, Dilsey, who is the African-American servant who finishes off the novel and brings everything together. But this book and his other novels really do play with this idea of how we perceive time, how we perceive memory, and how we create our own consciousness through those perceptions. So this draws some really close relationships to modernism in general. Faulkner at times saw himself as self-consciously modernist when he talked about writing As They Lay Dying, which was his fourth novel. He said he, quote, set out deliberately to write a tour de force. Before I began, I said, I'm going to write a book by which, at a pinch, I can stand or fall if I never touch ink again. So it was clear he was really trying to do something new and innovative, which was, it was an objective a lot of the modernists shared. This kind of make it new, have something that can stand the test of time. He also, in his writing, embraced communities steeped in tradition and history. So we talked before about popular culture, and part of popular culture is local culture, right? It's the kind of everyday people that oftentimes were only seen as comic relief in traditional literature. So he looks at both Western and quote unquote primitive traditions, and he sees those as kind of a relief from the upheavals and alienation of modernity. So when we're reading Faulkner, we have a lot of kind of folksy, down-home characters that represent, first of all, what's really happening, that even though modernity is happening, even though there are these massive, massive changes going on in the world with technology and culture, at the same time, there are still places where the past anchors us, right? And there is that continuity that continually pulls people back in. And so Faulkner's really interested in that specific theme and that specific topic. So, like I said, he wrote a tremendous amount of novels, many of which are considered some of the greatest novels in American history. His earliest work, 1926 Soldier's Pay, focused on kind of his own experience training for the Air Force. He never actually went to war, but he came back from training limping and saying it was a war wound. His first real novel that kind of established him was Sartorus, which was published by a New York publisher, but it was a very, very cut down version of the novel he wanted to have written, Flags in the Dust, which he's going to republish later. Like I said before, The Sound and the Fury came out the same year. This was kind of a landmark novel for him. It really showed innovative modernist aesthetics in the writing. It was followed up by As They Lay Dying, which is another kind of stream of consciousness novel where in As They Lay Dying, the individual chapters rotate through this family of characters who are trying to take their mother's body to a burial site. And it is one of the darkest comic novels in American literature. It's in sometimes just completely bizarre because you have everything from, you know, a very young child trying to deal with his mother's death and getting kind of this direct stream of consciousness from like a 6-year-old to the husband who just really wants to get to town so he can get himself some new teeth. It's a very strange novel. If you want to ever dip your toe into Faulkner, it's often a good place to start because it's one of his shorter novels and most accessible. In 1931, he wrote Sanctuary, so it's kind of important to realize that he's writing these novels for, 5 or 6 years, and they're critically acclaimed, but they're difficult books. So popularly, nobody's really paying attention to him. He's not making a lot of money writing these novels. They're not selling like Fitzgerald is selling at this time, which is part of why he goes off to work in Hollywood just to have a paycheck. But Sanctuary is different. Sanctuary is a potboiler. It's a dark and kind of twisted mystery novel, and that one does become popular, which brings him into kind of popular fiction. 1932's A Light in August. This is another really great place if you want to kind of dip your toe into Faulkner. This is one of his easiest books to read just because it is a self-contained story. You don't need to know a lot about the kind of interconnected characters. And it's also probably one of his most straightforward narratives other than Sanctuary. 1936, Absalom is considered one of his masterpieces of the Yoknapatawpha fiction. And then later he writes the Snopes trilogy, and we're going to see the Snopes in Barn Burning. We're going to talk a little bit about them. So his short stories, some of them are ranked as still the best in the world. He had this way of crafting finely wrought short stories that encapsulated a unified theme, including Rose for Emily, Dry September, and the one we're reading for this class, Barn Burning. So one of the things that Faulkner is best known for is his focus on the American South. He says when he's interviewed by the Paris Review in 1956, they ask him, why the South? And he said, I discovered that my own little postage stamp of native soil was worth writing about. and that I would never live long enough to exhaust it. And by sublimating the actual into the apocryphal, I would have a complete liberty to use whatever talent I might have to its absolute top. And what he's talking about there is his idea to develop this fictional place called Yoknapatawpha County. And Yoknapatawpha is a county that is based on his own hometown in Lafayette County, Mississippi. He says it's 2,400 square miles with a population of about 15,000. And 600 of those characters in that population are named or identified somewhere in his fiction. So he drew a map of Yoknapatawpha that was published in one of his novels, and many of his novels and short stories really revolve around this fictional county. You'll see reoccurring family names, just as you would in a small town, and reoccurring characters as well. With Yoknapatawpha, he was able to take a microcosm of American life and show the truth about humanity at large. The other thing he was able to do with Yoknapatawpha was to peel back what he called the thin yellowing veneer of Southern aristocracy. And what he did was he revealed the rotting social framework beneath, the racism, the violence, the incest, and the corruption. In Yoknapatawpha, there are two really important families you need to know about. The first is the Sartoris family. They are kind of the old wealth, the old aristocracy from pre-Civil War ages. And the other family that becomes really important in the Yoknapatawpha cycle is the Snopes family. The Snopes are kind of poor white trash. They are the dregs of society, the dumbest of the dumb, the worst that humanity has to offer. So when we see these characters coming into barn burning, you should pay attention to the fact that they really do kind of link to this larger narrative that Faulkner has about the kind of ideals of the Old South as this genteel world with hoop skirts and gentlemen, but that was really based on this decaying, violent past of racism and slavery and just corruption. And a lot of his fiction tries to kind of deal with how the history of that past continually comes forward. History is one of his major themes. He says in A Requiem for a Nun, there is a line that says, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And we see that in The Sound and the Fury when Benji's past literally kind of comes to the forefront and he can't distinguish between what has happened to him in the past and what is currently happening in the present. But the past reoccurs over and over and over in Faulkner's work. And he really has this kind of central question of how much does our past, our own past, but also the past history of the places that we are in, the families that we are part of, the communities that we are part of, how much do they determine our future? He says, quote, "No man is himself. He is the sum of his past. There is no such thing really as was, because the past is. It is a part of every man, every woman, and every moment. All of his and her ancestry, background, is all a part of himself and herself at any moment." And really understanding that Faulkner had this real kind of central theme running through all of his work can help you figure out the story we're reading for class. Because in it, we see Sardi, who was named after Colonel Sartoris, but who is a Snopes, kind of trying to figure out how much his past, or the past itself, that history between their families, will determine his future. So Faulkner did win the Nobel Prize, and his Nobel Prize speech is one of the more famous Nobel Prize speeches, and was kind of widely popularized, and people read it and were really admiring of it. So if we think of Faulkner as kind of a Southern writer, he didn't really think of himself that way. He thought of himself more as looking at this kind of universal human truth through this microcosm of the South. He said, "There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up? Because of this, the young man or woman writing today has forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because that is only worth writing about." So this idea of the conflict of the human heart in conflict with itself. He also says, "Man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he is alone among creatures, has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance." And those themes as well, this idea of endurance despite, compassion despite. He's really interested in those larger universal themes. So as you read through the piece by William Faulkner that we're reading for this unit, keep in mind that you should be looking at how his aesthetics, his sentence structure, the way he uses symbols and theme work to help underline the overall story, but also think about how setting the story in this larger Yoknapatawpha County and really thinking about history, especially in barn burning, this idea of blood and how blood is or is not destiny. If you have any questions, be sure to post them. I'm happy to answer them for you. And hopefully you enjoy your short introduction